If there's one thing Disney likes more than fairy tales, it's money. Something that after purchasing the Star Wars franchise in 2012, they have arguably made a lot of. But it hasn't just been about making money from the new Star Wars content. Disney have also been making bank off many of the older Star Wars properties, including in some cases old video games long out of production or sale. Welcome, my name's Azadash and welcome to another PlayStation 2 game retrospective video. It's hard to explain the hype for Star Wars Episode 2 unless you were actually a part of it. It didn't matter if you were watching TV, listening to radio, or surfing the net. Star Wars was everywhere and it was glorious. I personally have very vivid memories of spending hours every night in the lead up to its release on forums reading the latest news and theories. Now I say night because back in those days I only had access to dial-up internet, which used the family phone line, meaning the only time I was allowed to use the internet was after 8 PM. Of course, it was beyond slow by modern standards, but it worked just fine for the time. In the lead up to the movie's release, and then once the movie finally did release, demand for all of the tie-in products surged, which among other things included video games. There were 3 tie-in games for home consoles: Jedi Starfighter, Bounty Hunter, and the Clone Wars, with the Game Boy Advance also seeing the release of several titles, Attack of the Clones, and the new Droid Army. Probably the most interesting thing about all of these tie-in games were that none of them released for PC. Now, PC did get the excellent Jedi Outcast in 2002, but it was a completely unrelated franchise and not likely to scratch the itch for those wanting to experience the Clone Wars. As someone who didn't own a 6th generation console or a Game Boy during this time, I unfortunately missed out on all of these games, until recently when browsing the PlayStation Store in a late night stupor, I came across a port of the PS2 Clone Wars game. I had remembered seeing this game in stores and reading reviews, but I had never actually played it. With the promise of some enhancements and a fairly reasonable price of just $5, I decided to purchase it. As for the version of the game you actually get here, it's somewhat of an unusual mix. The game is based on the original PS2 game, however it appears to be running at a higher resolution, making some of the texture work look a little crisper than it originally did. Along with this resolution bump comes the rather unusual decision to lock the game in widescreen mode. The game did originally release with both an original 4:3 and 16:9 widescreen aspect ratio, which you could toggle from the menu. However, this toggle has been removed, offering only the widescreen resolution. Normally I would praise this as a good modernization. However, the issue is that in both the original and this re-release, the widescreen aspect ratio only applies to the game world and not the HUD, which is simply a stretched version of the original. It doesn't stand out too much, and granted the main game world is rendered in the appropriate aspect ratio, however it just seems unusual that they chose to remove the option to display the game as originally intended, without fixing the obvious issue with the HUD in the version that they have locked the player into. What's more, the pre-rendered cutscenes are also presented in a stretched aspect ratio, making them look a little out of place. However, given the game doesn't feature an awful lot of pre-rendered cutscenes, instead opting for more in-engine cutscenes, it's something that's fairly easy to ignore. At the end of the day, while I would have loved for these issues to be fixed, I am conscious that these are carryover issues from the initial release, and for a game that's priced at $5, it's probably unreasonable to expect that these would have been updated. However, I do think the absence of the original toggle between standard and widescreen presentation is an odd one, as it objectively would have taken more effort to remove this than to simply leave it in. If you are a purist and want to play the original experience, you can hunt down a copy on one of the original platforms, PlayStation 2, Xbox, or GameCube. However, for modern audiences, the convenience of being able to play this on modern hardware is probably worth a few rough edges when it comes to the presentation. Story-wise, the game begins alongside the movie's final act, with the player assuming control of Mace Windu as he works to eliminate the planet Geonosis' defensive capabilities and then escort transports containing Jedi to the main arena. Once the fight at the arena has broken out, the player is then tasked with helping to destroy the various enemy ships trying to flee the planet, with the final part of the level seeing you take on Count Dooku's Dark Acolytes. The whole first level kind of serves as a bit of a tutorial, introducing both ground and air combat, as well as reintroducing some of the film's characters. However, once this level is complete, the game follows its own independent plot, which circles around Count Dooku's search for an ancient Sith artifact, which is said to be able to be used as a super weapon. Like I mentioned in my X-Wing Alliance video, this is an example of a story trying to play it safe by centering around the Force as opposed to telling a more personable story. I mean, I get that they needed a story that the main protagonists of the game would have had a reason to be involved, that being Mace Windu, Obi-Wan, and Anakin, but I think there was a missed opportunity to introduce a new protagonist here with a story with a little more nuance than the simple Jedi versus Sith. Overall, I don't think the story necessarily detracts anything from the game, but it certainly doesn't add anything to it either. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's hop in our tank, hunt down Count Dooku, and head back to 2002 to remember the Clone Wars. Around the millennium, there were a lot of Star Wars games which simulated space combat, but not many that simulated ground combat, at least not from a third-person perspective. The Clone Wars changed this by making a good chunk of its gameplay take place firmly on the ground as opposed to in the air. Now, there are aerial missions, however there's fairly rigid limitations on how high you can fly above the ground, meaning that these missions play a lot more like ground combat as opposed to air combat. There's also a handful of on-foot sequences, and these handle like something totally different, more on this later. Regardless of which vessel you find yourself in, the level design follows a fairly simple design. You have main missions which are based on a specific in-game location, with these missions then being broken up into separate levels, sometimes involving a change between the vessel you are using. For example, in the first level alone, you start in a tank, then switch to on foot, then switch to a gunship, only to return to finish the level in a tank. I think it was a really good design decision to vary the gameplay like this, as despite all of the levels within the mission taking place in the same environment, the way the player interacts with them is vastly different. The objectives are also quite different between each level, with everything from search and destroy to protecting allies to outrunning a giant purple cloud. All of these constantly changing variables go a long way to ensure that the game never really gets boring, as you never really do one thing long enough for it to be. In terms of the craft you will be piloting throughout the game, there are 5 main ones, as well as a few specialty ones you control for relatively short segments. First up is the TX-130 tank. Now this is probably the most common craft the player will pilot throughout the game, with it featuring in many ground-based assault missions. It's pretty much the best all-round craft, with a good balance between speed, firepower, and defensive capability, without excelling at any one thing in particular. Its concussion missiles are a must to use against the more heavily armoured opposition, with refills thankfully being found before most large combat set pieces. Next up is my personal favourite, the Republic gunship. Now, fans of the movie will instantly recognise this craft, as it featured extensively in the film's final battle. The gunship excels at dealing high damage, however its speed and manoeuvrability leave it vulnerable to enemy fighters and well-placed ground defences, meaning it's often wise to focus on taking out aerial opposition first before moving on to ground targets. Outside of its lasers, it features cluster missiles which can destroy most targets with one hit. However, the real star of the gunship's offensive capabilities is the composite beam lasers, which are basically auto-targeting high-damage lasers which can fire at 4 independent targets at once. These are highly effective at eliminating several smaller enemies in one pass, or dealing very high damage to a larger craft. Another of the Republic ground craft is the AT-XT, and this is probably the most technical craft in the entire game. What I mean by that is that if you treat this like a tank, you'll rapidly see the game overscreen. The AT-XT is slow and features relatively poor standard defences. However, defences can be dramatically improved by using plasma shields, which offer a protective barrier on a relatively long cooldown. But where the AT-XT does excel at is its offensive capability, with both powerful lasers and mortars which can take out targets at range. As I said though, the key to success with the AT-XT is all about careful planning, removing powerful threats at range, and then slowly advancing on others, so not to become overwhelmed with enemy fire. Outside of the larger craft, there are 2 other smaller craft you can pilot. The first being the speeder bike. Now, this thing is very fast, has limited offensive capabilities, and practically no defenses. Thankfully, when the game does call upon its use, it's mainly used for chasing instead of fighting, something which it excels at. The final craft, well actually it's more of a creature, is the Maru. This is some type of dinosaur native to one of the planets you visit in the game, and this is by far my least favourite thing to use. It has poor defences, average offense, and average speed and handling. It features thermal detonators as a secondary weapon, but given the time needed to actually throw them and then wait for them to explode, it's often just better to pepper the target with lasers. It feels like someone in the development team just wanted to include dinosaurs, but honestly, it's just not very fun to use. Outside of piloting various craft, the game also features several on-foot segments. The problem is that these characters that you assume control of handle exactly like tanks as opposed to humans. Granted, this mechanic is used sparingly, but its execution feels more like a very early tech demo as opposed to something that belongs in a retail product. Now, no matter the craft you are piloting, camera and control are very good, and certainly give off a vibe that they were extensively playtested and tweaked, which makes the on-foot segment seem even more unusual. Alas, what is here when piloting is very good and certainly contributes to maintaining an overall high fun factor throughout the game's roughly 10-hour playtime. Now, I say 10 hours, and this is true for the base campaign. However, each mission also includes a variety of bonus objectives which provide the player with bonus points. These points are then used to unlock various in-game bonuses like new maps or even a making of video. You can go back to any of the missions and try to unlock more bonuses as you progress through the game, and broadly speaking, I'd say that the bonus objectives are challenging but possible. In terms of what I think doesn't work well with the game, honestly there's not much. While the game doesn't really push the boundaries on new and innovative gameplay, what's here is mostly very good with few exceptions. The first being the difficulty level, or more to the point, how the game scales difficulty. The Clone Wars' main difficulty scaling mechanism is to add more enemy units to combat. The problem with this is that it's less of a strategic challenge and more of a challenge to lock onto the right targets and engage them, with the game's generous auto-aim often switching between multiple on-screen enemies mid-engagement. This is compounded during scenarios where you need to protect friendly craft and have to deal with an increased enemy count around these friendly units, all while being able to sustain fire to protect these units. It feels strange to say this, but the game is a lot more enjoyable on the lower difficulty setting as opposed to the higher ones, simply due to the level of frustration the higher ones bring. I think there could have been a case to use different higher powered units against the player in the higher difficulty settings, as opposed to just increasing the quantity of the existing ones. Although even on the easy difficulty, the game does still provide some challenge, mostly in levels which require you to protect friendly craft. The other challenge I have with the game is the squad command feature. Now, let me be clear, I like the idea of it, but I just don't think it's overly useful. The idea behind it is that in certain missions, you can assign commands to your wingman. However, in practice, the majority of times you have a wingman, your commands just aren't that useful. You can command your wingman to attack a specific target, but by the time it takes you to lock onto a target and issue the command, in most cases you could have destroyed the target yourself. As for the defend command, well, this is even more puzzling, as the manual describes this command as hold current position, but the game lists it as defend. I'm not clear on if this means defend a target or defend the player. Either way, I largely ignored most of the squad commands and never really suffered as a result. Once you're done with the single player and bonus objectives, there's a fairly robust multiplayer mode which is gradually unlocked as you progress through the main campaign, with several modes available for local split-screen play. Overall, the Clone Wars gameplay is a pretty good experience. Yes, there are some parts which lack polish, and some design decisions which were perhaps not the best, but for the most part, the game is an entertaining experience from start to finish, with reasons to return to it in order to unlock all of the game's bonuses. Graphically, the game is one of the better looking games to grace the PlayStation 2, and indeed the early 2000s in general. The general art direction has held up remarkably well, and excluding the very low resolution loading screens, which aren't very frequent, the game looks really good on a modern display, something that certainly can't be said about every game from this era. There's also a lot of variety in the environments, with the player visiting planets covered in snow, desert, jungle, and much more, again keeping with the theme of one particular thing never hanging around long enough to become boring. Asset quality is likewise really good, and it's clear that the developers prioritized fidelity on items that the player would spend a lot of time viewing, such as the ship models, while ensuring that the environment was detailed enough to sell the illusion of the game world, without creating any performance bottlenecks. On the topic of performance, I am obviously not running this on original hardware, however I am running it on Sony's own approximation of PS2 hardware, which you would expect to retain a similar performance envelope to the original console. With this in mind, the only time I encountered any minor slowdown was in the first mission, where you take control of a gunship and there's a lot of particle effects on screen. But honestly, we're talking about very minor slowdown, and probably not something the average punter would even notice. Menus and other general presentation are all good, although a very minor nitpick is that you need to manually enter a menu to switch the camera perspective between first and third person. It isn't a huge issue, as most of the game is best experienced in third person. However, a button press would have been nice to have. Normally I get to this part of a Star Wars review and praise the audio design, as generally speaking, most Star Wars games have featured excellent audio. However, this is objectively the weakest part of the Clone Wars experience. Firstly, the voice acting is average at best.
It's about time. I thought I was gonna have to fight this whole war by myself.
I'm sure you would have too.
The Separatist forces are coming from that entrance. If we can push them back to their staging area, we may be able to gain the upper hand.
Sir, I have 5 Special Commando units awaiting your orders, sir.
Good. I will find a way to take down those Techno-Union ships. It should slow down their retreat.
While I didn't go in expecting exact copies of the film's cast voice, I did expect at least some focus to be put on the various mannerisms each character has. Alas, what's here is a long way off that. Anakin Skywalker probably sounds the best, but overall it's a pretty low bar. The music quality and balancing is fine, but the choice in the tracks is puzzling. The game uses a lot of tracks from the original trilogy, and while this is an outstanding soundtrack, it just doesn't feel like it belongs here. These are tunes that I associate with TIE Fighters and Darth Vader, not Republic gunships and Mace Windu. I can only assume this decision was made because they felt that there was not enough combat melodies to choose from within the Episode 2 soundtrack, but honestly I would have preferred them remix and reuse some of them, as opposed to falling back to the original trilogy. Sound effects are good though, and everything sounds as you would authentically expect it to. The Clone Wars is an excellent example of a good game that's simple enough to pick up and play, but that has enough depth for those wanting to master it. The Clone Wars doesn't do anything revolutionary, there's no groundbreaking mechanics, it's not pushing any graphical boundaries, and its story, while functional, certainly isn't a highlight. But what it does do, it does well, and most importantly, it's a fairly fun experience from start to finish, with very little downtime between action. As far as the packaging of the re-release goes, I don't have any real complaints about the carryover bugs like aspect ratio, given the price being asked here is about the cost of a cup of coffee, and unlike a cup of coffee, the game certainly gives you a reason to go back once you've finished it. Interestingly, the Clone Wars' largest legacy is likely the release of Star Wars Battlefront, which released 2 years later in 2004, and is still widely regarded as one of the best Star Wars shooters ever released. Battlefront took a lot of the concepts from the Clone Wars and improved upon them in pretty significant ways to provide a much larger scale battle environment, importantly with the ability to play online via the PlayStation 2 network adapter. Just 1 year later, there would be a sequel with Battlefront 2, again introducing some new things like space combat, while keeping what worked well in the original. Both games were so well received that they got re-releases in 2024, which along with some minor cosmetic changes, brought the game to modern console platforms, complete with modern online play. While it's unlikely we will ever see a re-release of the Clone Wars along the same lines of Battlefront 1 and 2, what is available is solid and something that anyone with a casual interest in Star Wars should certainly check out. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.